Lenten video devotional series. Again, I'm Pastor Dave. I've appreciated all the feedback and all the comments from the first couple of episodes and hope to continue that as we move along our journey in Lent. Today we're going to begin our discussion in the Gospel of Matthew, beginning at the 13th chapter. That day Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea. Such great crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat there while the whole crowd stood on the beach. And he told them many things in parables, saying, "Listen, a sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seeds fell on the path, and the birds came and ate them up. Other seeds fell on rocky ground, where they did not have much soil, and they sprang up quickly, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil, and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Let anyone with ears listen." Storytelling is an essential part of our faith, and Jesus demonstrates that over and over again through parables, by reaching back into the Hebrew text, all in an effort to let people know that God's kingdom is on its way. To let people know that God's presence is here and now. All we have to do is listen. Storytelling is what we do to communicate. We tell stories, we hear stories. Our stories give us a chance to describe what we see in the world, describe who we are to the world. They transform our lives both negatively and positively. As we saw just in this past week with the news from New Zealand, the stories we tell about others can be deadly. If we don't have the concept and hear the story of love for neighbor, for those around us, it can be life-taking instead of life-giving. Today we're sitting in our fellowship hall here at church, the original sanctuary. This is where Epiphany's story first began. The last couple of weeks I've had a chance to do some storytelling of my own. At the beginning of this spring semester down at our local community college, I started taking a class on children's book illustration. It was a chance for me to kind of get away from everything else, all my routines, and just have some intentional focus on creativity, on meeting some other people outside of the usual circles that I run in. And just yesterday, I had an incredible experience in class. This was the first time that all of the other students, we all gathered around, and we're about halfway through the class now. And this was the first time that all of us had a chance to hear what we were working on, sharing that, critiquing in a gentle way, but really a chance to be inspired by all the stories that I heard. So the class itself, our assignment was to either take an original story or reach back to some traditional fable or fairy tale and use that as our jumping off point. And then throughout the rest of the class, creating a storyboard, working on a way to communicate that story through any visual effects that we feel so drawn to. Some folks, they claim that they can't draw, but then in fact they're showing these beautiful light sketches or thinking of other ways that they can communicate visually what's going on in their story. So just going around the table, you got some insight from what's going on in people's lives, how they were been impacted from grandparents, stories that they've carried with them from childhood passed down in various traditions, some just stories bubbling out of them from songwriting, poetry. Well, as we were doing this, our exercise, it was really profound, seeing how people were responding to the stories. One person in particular was sharing a story that comes from their ancestral tradition, and the way they were trying to create it was that they were looking to create a good night book for children. But as they were describing the story itself and where they were stopping the story, it has actually caused more people to ask questions about, how does this story continue, and how do you share it when outside of this book project? And as she was describing the full story, this story about how the crows received their color, she was capturing something that was really powerful that wasn't in the story itself at that moment. Now, hopefully from our discussion, maybe she finds a way to work that in. As the crows were experiencing the changing of the seasons, of the sun rising and setting, the crows' colors changed until at the end, when night began to settle on them in an embrace, and they received their dark color. And it was at that moment that the teacher asked, well, why did they remain that color? And she said, well, then that's kind of how they ended up being. And it was like, what a beautiful image of this embrace, and letting them know that you are loved just the way you are now. We do so much trial and error and trying to figure out who we are and whose we are throughout our life journey, and to get to a point where our story can be recognized. We can see our true selves in that story, and finally be embraced by others in that way, in such a powerful way. So, excuse me. This is what I'm hearing as Jesus is scattering the seeds, or at least in the sower scattering the seeds around. Jesus' message is out there. This message of love, of divine love that goes out there. And sometimes it looks like a hit and a miss. Sometimes we put ourselves out. We become vulnerable and we get hurt. Sometimes we get hit with some of that infatuation that bubbles up quickly and fades out just as fast. Sometimes it makes us hesitant to share our story. Sometimes we don't want to hear another person's story because we have been harmed by someone's words in the past. These seeds of love that go out, hopefully they begin to start to gain root into your story. Hopefully, as we can continue to try and tell our own stories, our faith stories, they might sound awkward at first, but as we can continue to tell them, as others continue to hear them and say, wait, you're leaving out the best part of that story. That part where you recognize that you had found community, that you have been loved, that you are loved. Sometimes that's the hardest part of the story to share. Those seeds, those divine seeds spread out there for us to interweave with our story, to make sure that we know that we're part of a greater story. That is such a beautiful place to end up. When we can start in one space, here where Epiphany's journey started, and out of that grew and continues to weave its way as such a small congregation, but we have these many roots reaching down to North Carolina, to Africa, across the states. People who've been here, have been touched by this community, continue to hold on to it. And those who have been here since the very beginning, those who have come into this community just recently. All these stories that we can continue to share, create, and continue to make new the story of Epiphany. They have an impact not only on those who are in the community, but the ripple effects on how we talk about being agents of love, being instruments of peace, being those hands and feet of God's work and service in the world. And all of that begins by finding where our personal stories are connected into that story. So as you leave here, start talking about your story. Start thinking about how your story is woven in here. Or if you're having a hard time, there's always a place to come and wrestle with what's going on. What is that story? And hopefully, as we continue to walk this journey, we continue to tell our stories. We continue to share and listen to other people's stories. We'll be transformed as we continue to hear the story, not of the world that says, hey, you're not enough. The story that says, no, this place isn't for you. Hopefully, we can begin to hear that story of divine love that says, you are made with love. Your presence is important, is essential to the body of Christ. We need all these members working, challenging, questioning, seeking out how we can come together, how we can be spiritually nourished, how we can support each other in our brokenness, how we can be made whole in the community that God has tried to gather us together again and again. And in those moments, we can see the fruit that is born from those seeds. Until next time, God's peace. I look forward to hearing from you again. Take care.